Okay, we are now live. Good morning, I'm Sarah Townsend, the Committee Officer for this meeting this morning. Welcome to the meeting of the Pensions Committee. I am obliged to inform you that the meeting is being live streamed and recorded. Members of the public will be able to view the meeting using the link on the front of the agenda. First item on the agenda this morning is the election of chairman. Please can I have nominations?
I nominate Tom Biggins.
Seconded.
Okay, are you happy with that, Tom, to take the chairman? Brilliant. If you just go and take the chairman's seat and I'll hand over to you now, thanks. Whilst you're doing that, I've had a reminder from IT about using microphones as well, please.
Well, good morning, members. Thank you very much for electing me as the chair for the next 12 months. We'll move on to item 2, apologies and substitutions. And I believe we have apologies from Councillor Carolyn Healy and Councillor Ray Evans from Telford and Wrekin, and I don't believe we have any substitutions. I note Jean Smith isn't yet with us. We haven't actually had an apology from Jean, so if Jean doesn't appear during the meeting, we will record it as an apology, but at this moment in time we are expecting her. I think it's worth mentioning at this stage, I would just like to record with support of members, recording in minutes our congratulations to Councillor Malcolm Smith of Telford and Wrekin, who I believe received an award in the Queen's Jubilee Honours list. So with your agreement, we'll send our congratulations to Malcolm.
Yeah. Can I join you with that, Tom? Because I was mayor for the old Shrewsbury National Borough Council when he was mayor of Telford and Wrekin, and I know the amount of time that he committed to his community.
Yes.
So yeah, it's well merited.
Thank you for that. Now we'll move on to the appointment of vice chairman, and it's customary. If Shropshire holds the chair, the vice chair goes to Telford and Wrekin. So I'd like to propose, in her absence, Councillor Ray Evans. And may I have a seconder, please? Okay. Any other nominations? No. Well, in that case, we've elected Ray Evans as vice chairman. Item 4: disclosable pecuniary interests. Are there any disclosable interests, please? No. Okay. Well, in that case, we'll move on to minutes of the previous meeting. This was the meeting of the Pensions Committee held on the 18th of March 2022. Is it your wish that I sign them as a true and correct record? Can I have a proposer, please? I'll move. Can I have a seconder? Yep, Roger. Okay, thank you very much. And we now move on to item 6, public questions, and we have, I believe, 2 members of the public present to ask their questions. I'll call each in turn, and I believe there's a seat at the end of the table. Please come up to that. And it is Justin who will read out the responses. So the first question is from Mr. Jamie Russell. So if you'd like to please come to the table, Mr. Russell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Members of the committee. I need to get something to this framework.
It's the one on the right hand side.
Thank you. I'm a father of two young children, two girls aged 11 and 14, who are terrified about the climate crisis. They ask me how it is possible that my generation has allowed CO2 levels to rise to the highest levels in recorded human history. They ask me what it means when the UN Secretary General says that humanity is, quote, standing on the brink of the abyss, and that the fossil fuel industry has, quote, humanity by the throat. Most of all, they ask me what the future will look like for them when they are my age. Most of all, though, they ask me why CO2 levels are continuing to rise instead of falling. And to be honest with you, I don't know what to say to them. As a father, I have no idea what to tell them. My daughters have written to Shropshire Council in the past, calling on councillors, including some of the ones sitting here, to commit to taking the necessary action to stave off disaster. And that hasn't happened. Shropshire is not on track to slash emissions 45% by 2030, as the UN IPCC recommends. My daughters have also written to this pension fund committee and have called for the fund to divest. Because they've looked into it and they understand the mechanism of divestment and what that would mean. Yet this fund continues to invest in companies like BP and Shell, companies that are expanding oil and gas infrastructure beyond what is actually compatible with a 1.5 degree world. According to the Chatham House Climate Risk Report, which was released last year, we currently have a 5% chance of staying below 2 degrees and a 1% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. I feel like nobody in this room actually understands what that means in reality. Respected climate scientist Sir James Hansen, former director of NASA, now believes that claims to stay under 1.5 degree of global warming are, quote unquote, and please forgive my French here, but this is his correct scientist words, unadulterated bullshit. Some of you sitting on this committee are parents and perhaps even grandparents. If your children came to you in tears because the only version of the world they see ahead of them is one of widespread disaster and destruction, what would you say to them? Would you tell them that you, in your role on this committee, are doing everything that you can?
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Russell. And if we may now please have the response.
Okay, thank you, Chair. The response is, as has been reiterated many times in response to similar questions received at every Pensions Committee meeting, Shropshire County Pension Fund Pension Committee takes all its responsibilities very seriously, and this includes climate change risk. The significant progress the Pension Committee has made over the last 2 years to tackle these very important issues can be found on the Pension Fund's website.
Okay, and the next question is from Mrs. Mager.
Sal Major, and I'm asking it on her behalf.
Oh, right. Well, if you please like to, and sorry, who your name? Chris Hodge. Okay, super. Thank you very much.
Down considerably. Okay, so this is her question. Since SCPF is invested in both BP and Shell, does SCPF support the decision by BP to divest its 20% stake in Rosneft and support the decision by Shell to exit from joint ventures with Gazprom? If you do support these decisions, does SCPF consider that there are moral and ethical reasons to stop doing business with these Russian fossil fuel companies?
Okay, thank you very much. And the response, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair. The response is, on the 27th of February 2022, BP announced its intention to exit its 19.75% shareholding in Rosneft. BP's 2 nominated directors resigned from their posts with immediate effect. Shell's intention to exit its joint ventures with Gazprom was announced a day later on 28th of Feb 2022. BP and Shell have decided that involvements with Russian entities are no longer aligned with their business and strategy. This followed an international outcry over Russia's military aggression in Ukraine. Subsequently, governments around the world, including the UK government, imposed sanctions on Russian entities and individuals, including key personnel in Gazprom, Rosneft and Lukoil, the three largest Russian oil and gas companies. The UK imposed sanctions on the chief executives of Rosneft and Gazprom, which included an asset freeze and travel ban measures. The chairman of Gazprom, Gerhard Schroeder, resigned to avoid the threat of sanctions. As long-term investors, we support long-term decision-making by the companies which we invest in. The sanctions imposed by the international community on Russia and Russian companies made it very difficult for BP and Shell to continue with these relationships in any conventional business sense. With sanctions on share trading, dividends suspended and transactions in rubles frozen, it would have been difficult to have assessed how BP and Shell could have derived financial benefit from these relationships, certainly in the short term. What was already a challenging situation in terms of corporate governance became much more difficult post the invasion and the isolation of the Russian economy. Operational risks and reputational risks have also become more acute. These can be no doubt that decision-making at Gazprom and Rosneft is being influenced by geopolitics and not just business considerations. It is a matter of opinion as to whether you think this was the right thing to do from a moral or ethical perspective, but it appears to be underpinned by risk assessment and business considerations and based on the situation that prevailed at the time. It is correct that Shell and BP management make strategic calls, as long-term performance of the company is ultimately their responsibility.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I just
No.
add that I haven't actually asked a question here.
No, I'm
Could I
very
possibly say
sorry.
something very briefly about the economic basis?
I'm very sorry you can't. You should have tabled a question. I'm afraid
No,
I'm very sorry you
I'm
can't.
not asking a question. I'd just like to say something about
I'm
the
not.
economic
I'm
basis.
taking.
It's really important for this fund.
I'm
and it's very
taking
quick.
a decision
Very
as
quick.
chairman, and I'm not
Okay.
allowing that to take place.
Okay, well, this is really quick.
No,
Okay, there's a
I'm
lot
very
of
sorry. I'm
economists,
not allowing this.
economists who are challenging the economic basis. The
Look,
economic basis
I'm going to have to
that
adjourn the
these things are
meeting.
based on.
I'm very sorry. I'm going to have to adjourn the meeting.
It's
If you-
very quick. I'm not
Okay,
asking
well, I'm
a
very
question.
sorry. I'm going to adjourn the meeting. But my decision is you could have asked the question.
It
There is
wouldn't
a-
have been a question. That's
Well-
why I didn't ask it.
Well, you
There's
could
only
phrase
two
it as a
questions,
question.
Chair.
I'm very
It won't
sorry.
take very much time out of the
I'm
meeting.
not allowing it. No, I'm not allowing it. And so please remove yourself from the table.
I'm going to leave these here. This is incredibly important about the economic basis of which you're basing your climate risk.
Okay, I'll accept that. If you leave those there, I'll accept that. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So we will now re-adjourn the meeting, and we will now move on to item 7, the Shropshire.
Jim,
Yes.
On the point of order.
Yeah.
I notice there's no Charlton and Region members here.
Yeah.
Does they at least need to be represented on this committee or not?
There are substitutes, and the substitutes were invited to attend.
I understand
Yes.
that, but I mean, as they're not present today, are we called?
We are definitely
Thank you.
called. There's absolutely no question of doubt about that.
I can come in on that. It's 3 voting members that you need to be quorate.
Okay.
So we'll now move on to item 7, the Shropshire Pension Fund Audit Plan. And Mr. Grant Patterson from Grant Thornton will take us through this. And Grant is appearing today virtually on the screen in front of us. He's on the top right-hand quarter of our screen. So over to you, please, Grant.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully you can all hear me. Yes, today I'm just bringing the audit plan for the 21-22 audit. I'm sort of going to start on page 11 of your pack. I don't propose necessarily go for it automatically, sort of line by line, page by page. I think for those members who have sat on the committee before, you'll see that the plan itself is fairly similar to what you've seen in previous years, because overall the risk profile for the pension fund remains sort of very stable in that sense. Just highlighting probably on that page our response that we are reporting to you as pensions committee. I think under the governance arrangements, ultimately the council and the council's audit committee are formally those charged with governance in terms of approving the overall statement of accounts for the council. But we communicate with you as pensions committee because you have oversight of the annual report production, which effectively then leads into the statement of accounts for the actual council itself. So that's why we're reporting to yourselves on that basis. And on that, we've just highlighted some of the factors that we've taken into consideration as part of our risk assessment and risk planning around, the pandemic is still with us, and as you can see, we're hybrid working, picking up on developments in the pension fund universe. Isn't significant sort of changes. There have been sort of some changes in regulations. Cybersecurity continues to be an issue, although directly on our audit, we're comfortable around that. And just recognising, I think, from your perspective and probably from the also from the council side, financial reporting, that the FRC as our regulators continued spotlight on the work we do. If I take you to page 12, in terms of significant risks, these are very similar to prior years, where the significant risks we identified, we've rebutted them as a presumed risk around revenue recognition, i.e. income from your side. But again, we've gone for this, I think, in prior years, that we can track the contributions fairly straightforwardly, and actually measuring and auditing the investment income again is relatively straightforward. I'm not saying it is simple, and therefore we're satisfied the risk of fraud in that is very low, and therefore we can rebut that as a significant risk. I can't rebut management override of controls as non-rebuttable, but again, I think as members, if members are aware, obviously elsewhere, we primarily address that through our work on journals, because if management are going to manipulate the accounts, that's where they would have to do that. Alongside that, we do look at significant management judgments and estimates, etc., around that to make sure that there's not being maybe overly prudent or anything like that in terms of overriding of the controls. And then in terms of the pension fund, in terms of valuing your assets, the biggest challenge we have as auditors is around those level 3 assets where there's not a sort of a ready-made market. So that's where we would say that's a significant risk in terms of, in terms of getting a value approach to that. And I'll come on to that a little bit later. In terms of materiality, we base that around your net asset position. When we put this plan together, we were looking at the position at the end of December, and it's around about 1% of the net assets of the fund. We will look at that when the draft accounts sort of come through, but I think it's going to be stuff roughly stay the same, around £23 million. Page 13 really just covers the revenue bits and the management override that I've just alluded to. I think if I get to page 14, that's the work we're looking to do to address the risk in valuation of level 3 investments, which is primarily around looking at your own arrangements for that. We will sample those investments. We will look at getting specific valuations. If there's audited accounts, we will go back to those audited accounts. If in their absence, we'll look to do the competence, capabilities and objectivity of the investment managers as expert and use that as assurance. In terms of we will sort of test revaluations in the year going forward. So that's our overall approach to that. What I probably highlighted at the bottom of that page is, whilst we also look at revenue, we also need to consider, because you're a public sector body, if there's a risk of fraud in expenditure recognition as well. And again, having looked at that, when we can test benefits quite straightforwardly, and if there's transfers in or transfers out and lump sums, again, we will be able to get appropriate assurance for that. Therefore, again, we don't consider that to be a significant risk for the pension fund. The next couple of pages say that, which we discussed with you last year, the auditing standard on estimates and was changed last year. Therefore, there continues to be increased scrutiny from ourselves around that area. And the two areas of that, we're looking at level 2 and level 3 investments in terms of those which are harder to value. And we've already taken in before the previous pensions committee our informing audit risk assessment, where we've had that conversation with you in terms of around your approach to accounting estimates. Just on page 18, looking at going concern, just a reminder for the committee that in terms of going concern, practice note 10 effectively looks at service continuity. So again, there's looking at that whilst we need to complete our audit work. I've got no significant issues around going concern for the fund, and also if you look at the net assets compared to the outgoings as well, the fund is in it, projected to go on for a number of years. So again, no going concern issues and no impact around that. Just finally from me, I think on pages 20, just on our IT audit strategy, one thing probably just to highlight there, I think some movements in our IT strategy. We're not necessarily proposing to look at the operational effectiveness of some of our IT controls. Ours is a substantive audit, so that's probably going to be a slight tweak to our final approach for that, but I'll update the committee when we come back to that one. And in terms of audit fees, very similar to last year. They are subject to agreement with PSAA, but slight reduction on last year proposed going forward. And in terms of non-audit fees, just to highlight, we still do provide assurances to external other auditors of employers of the fund under the Code of Audit Practice, and that's our estimated cost of undertaking that work. And at that, I'm happy to stop and take questions.
Any questions? Yes, Brian.
Can I take you to page 15 of the council's papers, or it's page 7 of Grant Thornton's report? And at the bottom of this, it says specifically, do audit committee and pension committee members understand the characteristics of the methods and models used to make the accounting estimates and risks related to them, oversee management's process for making accounting estimates, including the use of models and the monitoring activities undertaken by management, and evaluate how management make the accounting estimates. Now, several of us here, 3 of us in fact, are on both audit and pension committee. And I do wonder if we are actually trained, have had the experience and training to do this. These activities strike me as needing professional financial training, and I wonder why we as pension committee members have to understand the detail of those particular processes. And I query whether, and I've been on audit and pensions for a long time, whether any of us are actually trained to do that in detail.
I suppose we're not expecting committee members to be experts in actually undertaking those estimates. I think that question is around is, do you understand how management is going about making those? Now, I think for a pension fund, you know, in terms of that, as I say, informing the risk assessment, it is in relation to probably to the valuation is probably the biggest estimates. So do you, and it's not for you to actually undertake the actual work yourself, it's for you to gain confidence from either your investment managers, your investment manager advisors, or from management directly around the basis for the figures that go in the financial statements. When you sign off financial statements, they are your financial statements. So are you comfortable at how your assets have been valued? That's not to say we're expecting you to be experts on the valuation methodology, but do you understand what underpins it? I can look at level 3s. I mean, as I say, level 3 ones, there should be behind most of those, or behind a lot of them, there will be company accounts that will underpin the valuation. We'll look at those. For others, they may well use like private equity valuation models and stuff like that. You don't need to know the details. I think what you just need to understand is, have those models been used? You will also find probably in some of your actual pension provider in investment managers, they will have service auditors reports that will say what their valuation process is. Again, I'm not expecting you necessarily to understand that, but you can, and I think actually at your fund, those tests are undertaken. People will read those service auditors reports. If you gain that assurance, then you can understand how that's been put together. So I think it's making of this from your side as governance in terms of that and saying, are these things happening? Do they seem reasonable to me? Not necessarily getting behind the actual factors themselves and the actual assumptions that are there. That's quite right what you employ experts to do. That's what their role is, to understand the market, to understand that. So I think it is understanding how it's happening in the background, because ultimately you'll be the one recommending the accounts and therefore understanding how to put together. So I think that if there is training required, it's around what's actually happening, what's happening on your behalf effectively, not necessarily saying fully train you in how to value a level 3 investment using one of the international models. As you say, that will take a lot of training and expertise, and there are even some other ones where actuaries will be involved if you had something like an insurance buy and you don't have one of those, whatever, using a number of factors to value it. So yes, you're quite right. You can place reliance upon experts. I think it's how you're gaining insurance that those experts from those is what we're asking for there.
Well, thank you, Grant. I must say I have absolute confidence in both our audit manager and our pension manager, and I'm happy to accept their assurances on these items, but that's not exactly what you have put in this report. What is here would give the impression that we have to have a much deeper understanding rather than simply to rely on the capabilities of our audit and pension managers.
Okay. If I may share, I think the important words within there are about understanding the characteristics. So about understanding the details, about understanding those characteristics. That second point uses the word oversee. Oversight is a hugely important element of this. So as a committee, you're having oversight of that. That doesn't mean you need to understand the detail, but you need to understand the basis on which that's been pulled together. And then the final element is, yeah, it specifically says evaluate how management made the accounting estimates. That's not making a judgment on those accounting estimates. That's not understanding in detail those accounting estimates, but it's understanding and evaluating how management made those. So it's incumbent on every committee member to ask the questions that they feel they need to ask to satisfy themselves that an appropriate estimate has been made or an appropriate methodology has been undertaken. That if you think about 3 lines of assurance, this is an oversight, and it's about ensuring that management responses that are coming back are giving you sufficient to have that oversight. And then the second level, the third level of assurance is external audit. So ultimately, they're giving you an independent assurance that the detail and the accounting elements of this work have been considered and reviewed.
I take comfort from those explanations. Thank you.
Yes, Roger.
It's to add to the previous conversation. Like James, I was present at a governance training session run by another body earlier this week, and as an example, they gave what happened down in London to that big block of flats which caught fire, and they brought the cabinet member in and said, how did you arrive at your decision? And the answer that came back was, I accepted what was said. The person there at the other end of the table said, did you not ask the writer of the reports and not the presenter of the reports? And there was no answer. So, okay, yes, we do accept what the management say, but as a governance, do we also need to see how it was arrived at and see some background details on it? We don't know what we don't know. So it's asking those intelligent questions and getting the answers there that we need. I'm not saying there's anything wrong, but I echo the thoughts there. How do we know what questions to ask?
Okay. Any other questions? I've just got a quick question. What I'm referring to is a sort of really a national issue. It's not Shropshire specific, but of course we are embroiled in it. Audits seem to be taking longer and longer to sign off, and particularly sort of signing off accounts as well. The whole process does seem to be getting more and more elongated as years progress. Have you any comments on this?
We are looking to, address the backlog as a firm. As you're saying, it's not just Grant Thornton that's involved in that element of it. I think first comment is audits are getting more complex. The expectations on auditors to, and actually picked up on the points, that the questions that just happen to be more challenging and more sceptical means that generally there is more audit work to undertake. So they will take longer. And I think from your perspective is, I wouldn't wish to give an opinion where we haven't undertaken sufficient audit work to actually support that opinion. So we need to be independent and give that assurance. But we do recognise that, the longer they do they do drag on, then I suppose the relevance becomes less. So in terms of the pension fund, I know I haven't yet issued the opinion for 2021. That's because we're still working on some final bits for the council's audit for 2021, and we're looking to sort of bring that to a conclusion at the next audit committee there. But we did complete all our audit work, so I was comfortable in 2021 pension fund. We'd actually finished that by, I think, the end of September or around that. So I think for the pension fund audit, we will have completed our work when in September, and actually part of that will be to ensure that I can give the relevant assurances to both the administering authority and to the main employer, which is Telford and Wrekin, around the figures that go into their financial statements. So I think from your perspective, I think as a pensions committee, we will have completed our audit in the timelines available. I think at the moment we are looking at most of our local government to one, clear the backlog, and then we are, for the majority of our clients, looking to finish our work by the end of November, which is the revised deadline. So, and then I think we are looking to, you know, in a way, get back into a normal audit cycle, in inverted commas, around that timeline. So I think there was conversations to be had with MHC or to look around the actual final deadlines. I think it is the end of November for this year. I think that for 22-23, I don't think a formal announcement's been made. But I think our overall line is to align and get it back into that normal cycle. And certainly when, I suppose, the new PSAA contract kicks in from 23-24, that we are then back on that cycle and able to achieve, and I think as members want, that we do complete audits appropriately, undertaking sort of appropriate professional skepticism and challenge within appropriate timelines as well. So I suppose in the way we are working our way through that backlog, and we're prioritising that now. When we will look to get back to a normal cycle, I am looking at finishing the majority of our audit work, certainly in out of the Birmingham office, by the end of November. So that should become more timely as we progress. But I suppose in the old rule things is we won't issue an opinion if we're not satisfied that we haven't got the assurances required before doing so.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? Well, in that case, no. I'll just like to thank Grant for your presentations. Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I have, unfortunately, I do need to leave today's meeting following that, so I will leave you to get on with the rest of the business. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move on to item 8, the actuarial valuation of 2022, and Michelle Doman and Mark Wilson, who are present here today from Mercer's, will take us through the presentation. So over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for inviting us here today to talk to you. Before we kick off with the valuation itself, I thought it's worth a couple of quick instructions. Those who have been around a little while longer but haven't met me before, no, it's not John Livesey with long blonde hair. I'm a relatively new face to the Shropshire team, although I joined the team at Mercer working on Shropshire funds around about 3 years ago, so just when you were sort of in the middle of your last valuation. But I'm a senior fund actuary, and I've been in the pensions industry for over 20 years at Mercer, and I work on a number of other LGPS funds too. A face you may recognise is my colleague Mark Wilson.
Hello, apologies to people at home who can't, excuse me, apologies to the people online who might not be able to see me. People in the room will probably agree it's for the best. But I am also an actuary at Mercer. I've worked in the Shropshire Fund for maybe 12 to 15 years. Before that, I worked with John Livesey, and now I work with Michelle, and together we'll be overseeing this valuation for 2022.
Thanks, Mark. So we've got around an hour and a quarter to talk to you today about the valuation. The key focus for today is training. For some of you, it'll be a recap on the basics. For others, it will all be new. But the idea is to leave you very well positioned when it then comes to setting the strategy later in the year. Some of you'll be forgiven for thinking this is an easy valuation, and in one sense it is. We've seen, and I'll come back to touch on, we've seen, strong funding levels at the 31st of March at the valuation date, which was, a good place to be.
but it's also a challenging valuation because of what's unfolding in the markets at the moment, and the cost of living crisis in particular. And therefore the decisions taken at this valuation are going to be particularly important in setting the path as we head through to 2025. And the key will be to make sure we're best positioned to sort of navigate this tricky time as best we can. So in terms of the agenda, so we're just turning to page 2. Mark's going to start with an overview of the key basics to valuing pension schemes and what's particularly important, what we need to focus on, before then giving you a recap on the 2019 valuation and the key outcomes from that. I'll then touch on what's happened since then, the funding progression and the outlook for 2022, before we then touch on some of the key themes, what's going to be the focus for 2022 that we're going to have to think particularly hard about. I'd say happy to take questions as we go along, but I'm conscious this is a hybrid meeting. So to sort of manage that, what I suggest is that we take questions, we'll pause for questions at sort of each section and take it sort of managed as we go through, but there will be time for questions at the end as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Mark.
Thank you, Michelle. So we're starting on slide 3, which is headed "Why do evaluation number 1?" So why do we do evaluation? As the heading alludes to, there are 2 reasons. The first is simply that we have to. It's written into the regulations. It's a legal requirement of the fund to do evaluation currently every 3 years. But it is worth looking at the regulations and seeing what they say. So it does give you an idea of some of the key challenges that the pension fund faces in meeting its requirements and its key goals. So the regulations require, firstly, for the fund to achieve as near as constant as possible primary rate. Now, your primary rate is your future service contributions that covers new benefits being earned. It's the percentage of pay. There's a requirement for that to be as constant as possible. There's also a requirement to secure the long-term cost efficiency of the scheme. Now, we take that to mean keeping contributions stable and at a reasonable level for the employers. But against that, there's also a requirement to secure the solvency of the scheme. And this is where some of the tension at the heart of the pension fund, if you like, comes from, because the easiest way to secure the solvency of the scheme is just to have a very, very low risk investment strategy. You have very high contributions, you get a lot of money in, you're not taking any risk, and your fund is very secure. But that isn't fair to the employers, and it doesn't result in long-term cost efficiency. So what we need to do as a fund all the time, and particularly each evaluation, is manage those 2 competing objectives between the need for cost efficiency, stability, and for long-term security. So that's kind of at the heart of everything we do as part of evaluation. So if we move on to the next slide, the other reason we do evaluation is because it's just good practice. The pension fund is a very long-term proposition, and so it makes sense to check in regularly and make small corrections as needed. If we checked in less frequently, if we did valuations out, say, every 10 years, then there's a lot more scope for the pension fund to run off course compared to its long-term objectives. And so when you do look in, the corrections you have to make will be much larger, and that isn't helpful for, in particular, employers trying to manage the budgets. So it makes sense to check in regularly, hopefully make small corrections and keep yourself on course for the long term. Now, in practice, there are 2 parts to the valuation. The first is backwards looking. So we look at the earned benefits of all the members. We look at the pensioners, the current employees, and the deferred members, those who've left employment but haven't yet retired. We look at all of their benefits. Essentially, we place a pound's value on them. We compare that to how much money the fund actually has, and that gives you a surplus or a deficit. Now, the second part of the valuation is forward-looking. Unlike most private sector schemes, the fund is open to new members and new accrual, so more benefits are being earned every day. So you need to cost those benefits and you need to fund for them as they arise. And the result of this is the 2 contribution rate elements that employers pay. You've got your future service percentage contribution rate to cover new benefits, and you've got your pounds amount deficit contributions or occasionally surplus offsets to correct any deficit or surplus. Now, we do this at fund level, but we also do it for each employer separately. It's important to remember that there are a lot of employers in the fund and each is responsible for their own position. There's no cross subsidies. So each employer gets their own valuation, their own contribution rate, and they can vary significantly. We'll probably touch on that a few times throughout the presentation because it is very important. So if we move on to the next slide, headed Financing the Benefits. This is a very simple representation of a pension fund. It's just designed to illustrate key points effectively. So the fund has to pay benefits, whatever they may be. You don't have any control on what the benefits are. And to do that, you only have two sources of income. The one is investment returns, and the other is your contributions. Now, as I say, benefits you have no control over. You have some control over your investment returns. You review your strategy regularly, you adjust it as need be, but ultimately you have to put that money into the market. And when you do, you are to a certain degree at the mercy of the markets. So the contributions are effectively a balancing item. Any benefits that aren't covered by investment returns have to be covered by contributions. There's no option there. You can't not pay the benefits. So ultimately, in the long term, the contributions will be whatever they need to be to make sure those benefits get paid. And so that links back to what I talked about at the start, the tension between cost stability and kind of long-term solvency. This is something we have to consider part of the valuation, and it also feeds into your investment work, no doubt. Setting a balance for yourself as a fund between the risks you want to take on and what that means for your employers and the contributions that they pay. So we move on to slide 6. This is a representation of what the pension fund looks like in terms of benefit payments. So currently we're paying out benefits to existing pensioners. Over the next 20 years, the amounts we pay out are going to increase as more and more people retire. They take the lump sums, they start to claim their pensions. Peaks at maybe 20 to 25 years, and at that point it starts to tail off as the current pensioners start to pass away. Accelerates then after maybe 30 to 40 years as current active members who haven't even retired yet start to die off, and the whole thing unwinds itself after maybe 80 to 85 years. Now, there's a couple of reasons that we show this. Firstly, just to illustrate the long-term nature of the fund, 80 to 85 years, and that is a rolling target. We've got new members earning new benefits every day, so these bars are getting added to all the time. So you're looking at a consistent, continuous 80 to 85 year period. And the reason we emphasize that is because as a pension fund, you need to be equally long-term in your thinking. So we consider what's going on in the markets at the moment, and we consider short-term considerations, of course, but we also have to put them in a long-term context. We have to make decisions that are in the long-term benefit of the fund. The second reason for showing this is to show you what illustrates the benefit size and so the cost of the fund. Broadly speaking, financial aspects, financial matters, they affect the size of these bars, the size of the payments, and then demographic factors, they influence how many bars there are, so they influence the term that they have to be paid over. So the main financial factor is inflation. All of the benefits are linked directly or indirectly, in most cases directly, to CPI inflation. So the kind of relationship is quite simple, excuse me. If CPI goes up and the cost of the pension fund goes up, very topical at the minute, and we'll touch on that a little bit more later. But similarly, lower inflation and the cost of benefits go down. The main demographic factor is life expectancy. If members live longer, all of these bars extend out and your pension fund gets more expensive. And similarly, if they live less, then it gets cheaper. Now, I'll emphasize a point I made briefly in the last slide, which is you don't control any of these factors. You as a fund have no control at all over what benefits get paid. It's dictated by the scheme regulations and by the levels of inflation and by the choices members make and how long they live. You can't control any of these things. Now, as part of the valuation, what we do is essentially we replicate this model by making assumptions. So we'll make an assumption about what future inflation will be. We'll make an assumption on life expectancy. We'll make assumptions about what members do. And we'll use all of that to create a chart similar to this. And it will be a representation of the future fund. We'll then look at your investment strategy. And we'll say, okay, if we need to make all of these payments in the future, how much money do we need now to make all of them? And with that process, we collapse all of this down to a single number, and that is your liability value, which then gets compared to your assets to arrive at your balance sheet and ultimately your deficit contributions. And then a similar process again for your future service, for your percentage contributions. So if we move on to the next slide on assumptions, given what I've just said, obviously the assumptions are a key part of the valuation, and the assumptions that we make or that you make ultimately will have a significant impact on the results we see, and so what employers, actually pay into the fund. So by far and away the most important assumption is the investment return. We call it the discount rate. the inflation assumption, and in particular, the difference between them. It really is the difference between them that's key. And if inflation of 9% is not a problem if you're earning 12% a year on your investment returns. If inflation's at 9% and you're only earning 6%, and that continues for a period of time, then that becomes a real problem, because that excess return, as I've said, over inflation is used to pay benefits. So as part of the valuation, a significant amount of work will go into choosing that discount rate above inflation, setting it at an appropriate level that matches with your views on risk as a fund, but also delivers reasonable, affordable contributions for employers. I won't go through all the assumptions, but I'll touch on a couple of others. First is life expectancy. It's always an important assumption, but particularly difficult at this valuation because we have the impacts of COVID. What we do as part of the valuation is we look at the fund's experience over the last 10 years. And we look at death rates versus national averages, that kind of thing, and we arrive at an assumption for the fund that's then applied to all employers in the fund. Now, as part of this valuation, what we will do is we'll strip out the impacts of COVID, because the death rates we saw over 2020 and 2021, we don't expect those to be replicated long term, and so if we build them in, we'll end up with life expectancy assumptions that are too short, and we'll end up undervaluing those liabilities. So we'll strip out the impacts of COVID that we've seen so far when setting that assumption. Now, looking forward, we have considered the impact of COVID in the longer term, but our view is at this stage, it's too hard. There's not enough evidence to really say what that long-term impact will be. There are views that it will increase death rates in the longer term, that we'll see another layer of deaths on top of flus, for example, and so we'll see shorter life expectancy and more deaths going forward. But there are alternative views, either that, for example, the death rates will replace flus in some way and overall rates will stay similar. There are even views that this might ultimately lead to an improvement in future life expectancy as people become more careful and change their behaviours, and science evolves to help us kind of manage the risk and other risks going forward. Ultimately, our view is it's probably too early to say on any of these things, and so we'll opt for a fairly steady middle of the road approach and keeping the assumptions broadly in line with what they were before in terms of future life expectancies. And so we'll assume that the impact of COVID in the long term will be fairly neutral at this stage. But obviously we'll keep that under review going forward and at future valuations as new evidence emerges. The other assumption I just want to touch on briefly is salary increases. This is one that always gets a lot of focus, and to be honest, it gets more focus than it really warrants. It's easy to see why the focus happens. Out of all the assumptions, it's the one that everyone can really understand and have a view on. And in particular, the long-term assumption that we set is often higher than employers might normally expect. So at valuations, we're often challenged because the assumption at the last valuation, for example, was pay increases of 1.25% above CPI. And what we hear back from employers is that we aren't planning to award salary increases anywhere near that level. So this comes back to the previous slide where I say it's a very long-term assumption. So we can't be unduly swayed by what employers are planning to do in the next couple of years. We've got to take a view on how pay is going to increase over the next 20 years or so. Also worth bearing in mind that it's an assumption on pay awards, not pay growth. If employers are cutting their overall staffing levels, then their overall pay bill will come down. But if they're still giving increases to existing staff, then that's what we're trying to get at with the assumption. Now, the reason I say it gets too much attention is because ultimately it doesn't make that much difference to the valuation results, and the impact it does make is reducing year on year. Now, future benefits being earned are no longer linked to final salary, they're linked to CPI inflation, so it doesn't impact that percentage of pay rate. It doesn't impact any deferred members or pensioners, because when you leave the fund, any link to your final salary is severed. It also only affects some of active members' benefits, so essentially it only affects a portion of the fund overall. So the overall impact is a lot less than employers would typically think, and you might think. Now, we've illustrated this on the next slide. We've looked at the actual impact of changing some of these assumptions, so you can see what would happen in reality. As you can see, and as I've already said, by far the biggest impact is the discount rate and inflation assumptions. So if you reduce your discount rate, your assumed future return by 0.25% a year, then what that will do in practice is it'll knock about 4.5% off your it will add 4.5% onto your liabilities, which in turn will mean an extra 2.6% of pay in deficit contributions. and it would also add 1.4% on staff's future service contribution rates. So in total, it increases your contributions by about 4% of pay a year. So it really makes a huge difference. Impact of inflation is very similar, as I say. Essentially, a 1/4% less in returns is pretty much the same as a 1/4% more in inflation. You're still squeezing that real gap that is important. So again, if inflation in the long term goes up by a 1/4% a year, then that adds about 4% onto your contributions. On the next row, you can see what I'm saying about salary growth. If pay increases go up a 1/4% a year for the next 20, 30 years, that doesn't impact your future service contributions, and it only adds about 0.3% to the deficit contributions. So the impact is fairly small. And finally, on life expectancy, as part of the valuation, we make an assumption on how life expectancy will improve in future. If we change that by a 1/4% a year, then that adds around 0.5, 0.6% to the total contributions. So these are the key assumptions, and this gives you an idea of how they actually impact the valuation. And from that, you can see the first 2 rows are by far the most impactful, and so that's where the bulk of the focus belongs. So on the next slide, we just take a brief detour from valuations to talk about accounting. We include this mainly because it's always of interest to employers, and it's always a source of trouble and consternation to them. Essentially, what happens is the fund produces 2 different sets of figures for employers. So you do your valuation, which we're talking about today. You go through the process, you look at the fund's investments, you arrive at a value on the liabilities that you think is appropriate for the pension fund based on your circumstances, based on your experience, based on what you're planning to do. Separately, the fund produces accounting figures for employers. Now, these are done purely to satisfy the accounting requirements, and they're done in line with what the accounting regulations say. Now, in practice, the accounting regulations are quite prescriptive around assumptions. In particular, they make you assume a very low discount rate based on corporate bonds. So what that means in practice is you end up with very high liabilities because that discount rate has been squeezed. And so you end up with a much worse balance sheet position for accounting than you do for funding. It's often a problem for employers in practice because they'll do the valuation and they'll get a great set of results that tells them they're fully funded or 105% funded, and they get their accounting figures and then they are completely different and they show a large deficit. It can be a real cause for concern. I just emphasise that accounting figures, again, are just to meet the accounting requirements. The fund doesn't use them for anything. They don't impact anyone's contributions, and they aren't a particularly helpful view of an employer's actual position within the fund. They are just to meet the accounting requirements. On the next slide, we're just going to touch on briefly the roles and responsibilities of the different parties to the valuation. If we start with the committee's role is to set the overall objectives for the fund. So you set the direction of travel, the key priorities. Then, once this has been turned into a funding strategy by the fund officers, you will then approve that strategy, and that will govern how the fund operates for the next 3 years. We also have the pensions board, who have an oversight role. They're there to ensure the fund is compliant with the regulations, to ensure that governance is appropriate, the fund is well run, to help the administering authority as need be, but they don't have any direct decision-making powers. Next, we have the fund actuaries, myself and Michelle. We advise on assumption setting and funding strategy. Probably important to note that we do advise. We don't ultimately set the assumptions. We advise the fund, and we certainly set kind of bookends, ranges on which you couldn't go outside of because they're not justifiable. But within those ranges, we are advisors, and the assumptions that get used are ultimately the fund's assumptions. And same with the funding strategy. We'll advise on that, but that is your strategy and should reflect your views as a fund. And then we will also crunch all the numbers. We'll perform the calculations over the next few months. And then once we have results, we'll meet with employers, discuss with them, and ultimately we'll certify the final contributions that will then become a legal obligation of the employers over the next 3 years. And then we have the employers themselves, who are obviously a party to this. They ultimately fund the pension fund to a large degree by the contributions. Firstly, they'll feed into the fund strategy. Later in the year, once the funding strategy is agreed by yourselves, we'll go out to employer consultation. They'll have a chance to feed into that, and we'd encourage all employers to do that. The fund can then take in those responses and, where necessary, make adjustments to the strategy. They also have a big role in providing data. If we don't have good data, then we can't produce good results. And in particular, where we don't get good data, or we don't have sufficient data from an individual employer, we have to make assumptions, and the assumptions we make are generally prudent. which means we put a higher value on liabilities and higher contributions. So we really are reliant on employers to provide the fund with good data to make sure that we can produce as accurate results as possible, and so they can pay appropriate contributions, And then finally, we have the fund officers. They really sit at the centre of all of this because they will coordinate all the different parties. So they will be speaking to yourselves and taking on your views by committee and working to turn that into a fund strategy. All our dealings will be with the officers. We'll be discussing assumptions with them, employer results. We'll be getting data from them. We'll be coordinating all of our side of the work with them. And they'll also be managing communications with the employers, both now in terms of getting data in and later in the process in terms of setting those individual employer contribution rates. So they sit at the centre of it, they make the whole process run, and they kind of manage the day-to-day work. So on the next slide, I've just got a little bit on the division of officer and committee responsibilities. I've already touched on this, but to be clear, how it works in practice is the committee will set the overall strategy, the ultimate direction of travel for the fund. It's up to the fund officers to gather those committee views and to take those views and to turn it into a detailed strategy that the fund can use to operate and run by over the next 3 years. The officers will also use that input and strategy and the general views on risk to set the assumptions, which will then feed into the strategy and also into the contributions. And then once we have that, this will all come back to yourselves for approval. And then you'll have a chance to input, make any suggestions, request any changes, and then the strategy gets confirmed. So this is how it operates in practice. And the final slide in this section, just important to think about where funding sets within the wider pension fund. So as part of this work, we set a funding strategy, and this is the bulk of the focus today. The funding strategy details assumptions, dealings with employers, that kind of thing. But it's also very linked to the investment strategy, of course. In particular, as part of your investment work, you'll decide on your tolerance on risk. You'll decide on how you want to invest given that view on risk, and that will then inform the discount rate and the assumptions that we use as part of the funding work. And of course, all of this is underpinned by the covenant of the employers, the strength of the employers, because the strength of the employers will dictate in part your views on risk. Now, it's important to remember there again that it's a fund of many employers. And while the central employers, in particular the two councils, have a very strong covenant because of their taxpayer backing, you have a wide range of employers who have a wide range of covenant strengths. Some of your employers will be weaker. And it's important that your funding strategy reflects that and deals with different types and groups of employers differently. So that's the first section on valuation and funding basics. I'll just...
Hi, excuse me. Sorry, can I do a pause for a question before we move on, if that's okay?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, it worked. Thank you. Sorry, it was just on the integrated approach point where you've highlighted the need to integrate investment. We carried out quite a detailed investment strategy review with the committee, which we only resolved maybe a year or so ago. I wonder though that the market environment has, as you've highlighted, has changed significantly. And I wonder, rather than, if you like, consider the investment strategy put to bed and build the valuation all around that, whether it's worth the committee having another look at the investment strategy. I'm not saying necessarily it will change radically, but another look at it in light of the current market environment, such that we can feed into the valuation process at an early stage rather than, if you like, down the line.
If that's a question to me, I'll answer first, and then other people can join in as need be. I think this would be one where we certainly wouldn't, as actuaries, wouldn't the tail to wag the dog. If you want to review as a fund your investment strategy, then you should do that, and the impact on the valuation work should probably come secondary to that. If you think the current conditions warrant a review of the investment strategy, then I would encourage you to undertake that. And if that happens, we will then look how we can build in any revised results to the valuation work and to set in the discount rate. But I certainly wouldn't want to say that you shouldn't do that just because we're, at the beginning of the valuation process and we're looking to set assumptions. If you think the situation as it is now warrants this work as a committee, as a fund, then you should definitely do that. And we as actuaries will incorporate whatever you do into our valuation work. Is that okay, Louis?
Yeah, I guess it's a question for the wider committee as well about whether they'd like to look at this a little bit more. And I'm conscious there's a mix of new members that haven't probably done much strategic work with us before, and the older members that will remember we've spent quite a lot of time doing it over the last few years. So it's a question what the committee would like to do.
Okay. Can I question whether we've time to do this if we want to get the valuation in reasonable time scale? Have we time as a committee to review our funding strategy in order for it to be incorporated into the valuation without delaying it for, say, 6 or 9 months?
I think any changes at this stage would probably delay things, but you do have time to do it. I mean, ultimately, the results have to be signed off by 31 March next year. So you would have time to do it. I think realistically, if you wanted it to feed into the valuation, it would probably need to be done quite quickly. I would think by maybe in the next couple of months at the latest, we'd need to know what the strategy is to be able to incorporate it. There is a little time to play with, but not a huge amount of time.
What we can do to facilitate that is we can work closely with Aon to agree the sort of key parameters, and key parameters being sort of the expected return and sort of key sort of direction of travel, because we can work with early views from Aon and look to model that alongside their advice to you, so that we can, let's say, we can be dealing with the two things side by side rather than one necessarily leading the other. But as Mark says, and as Louise alluded to, I think the market environment, will come on to it later in the training, the market environment does warrant a sort of a pause and question. And even if the decision post review is that you don't make changes, we are entering into a sort of new world, and hopefully it will be short-lived, but we need to position ourselves now. We're talking to you from a valuation perspective about positioning yourself ready for over the next period, but from an investment perspective, it's going to be crucial.
I think that just in terms of timing, I think the next committee meeting, I think is it September?
Yes.
So I think we would aim to bring something to the committee for that. I think it would focus particularly on the kind of inflationary, potentially recessionary kind of market environment, and highlight those risks. I think we've probably got fairly tight parameters in terms of what we can do, but we can look at some of the things that we can do as well. So I think we could do it for September timescales, and we could be very focused on, if you like, the market environment risks at the moment, rather than too wide a look.
Roger.
Just wondering, Chairman, and I know there's a division on the committee, but we did have some questions at the start. If we wanted to alter our strategy on fossil fuels and something like this, is this the place it could be done? Is there time to do it now? Is it possible to do it now?
I think, sorry.
Just going to comment on the timing, just to sort of separate 2 points. So in terms of the investment, for how it feeds into the valuation, the key is really around the decision making rather than the implementing. So the sort of focus is the timing of, once those decisions have been made and the sort of main direction of travel, that's sufficient for the valuation purposes. You don't actually have to transition the assets by that time as well. So I know that doesn't directly answer your question, but it was more to give sort of a bit more comfort around around the remit that we're working with.
Okay, I've just got a question. Really, it's for the benefit of newer members. It's going back to slide 4, where we've got the signposts, past benefits and future benefits. And the question is this, really: when we say that the fund is perhaps 100% funded, liabilities, investments meet liabilities, are we talking about past benefits and future benefits, or are we just talking about past benefits looking backwards?
That's just about the past benefits. So it's only the past benefits that have a funding level, because they're already earned, and so we look at everything that has been earned and we put a pound amount on that, which we call the liabilities. We compare that to the assets, and then that gives us a funding level, 90% funded, 85% funded, 105, whatever it may be. Separately, for the future benefits, we look to fund them as they're earned in effect. So we pay contributions, and the idea is that the contributions, as you pay them, cover 100% of those benefits earned. And so at that point, those contributions are paid, they're kind of automatically 100% funded. Now that may vary over time as the markets have an impact and the members make different choices. But at the point those contributions paid, they would be in effect 100% funded.
Thank you very much. It's useful so new members are aware where the funding gaps can actually develop and the need for corrective action. So thank you very much for that. Simon.
Yeah, just quick on your slide 8, your inflation rate at 40% per annum.
Yes.
Does that stretch back? Where do you get that 40% down?
This is just an illustration. It's just, for example, if inflation went up 0.25% a year for the next 80 years, what would the impact be?
Yeah, it is over a very long term.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean,
okay.
It's just obviously today. That's clearly.
Yeah. Inflation is going up.
No, that's fine. Thank you. I fully understand.
No problem. Are there any more questions on that section?
Yes, we have.
Which one?
The one on the speed rise.
Yeah, that question on the same slide on the to use the inflation one again. Would that as a 0.25%, the total, if that was 11%, would you have to times it by how many to get to 11, or is there some other little bit that if it was 11%, the total would be larger?
No, so essentially, if it was 11% a year, then this is just the impact of moving to 11.25. So it is just added in a quarter. So what we do in practice is we look at what inflation we think it will be each future year. So this year we might allow 9% because of where we are currently. Then I don't have the exact numbers, but next year we might assume it's going down to 5 and then 4, 3 and so forth. So what we're doing there is we're just increasing each of those assumptions by 0.25%, if you like. So it's just however inflation shakes out in the future in terms of lower now, higher later, higher now, lower later. It's on average that going up by 0.25% over the period, however that may fall in practice. So I guess to give an example based on the current, if inflation was supposed to be really high for the next 3 years, in the terms of setting a long-term assumption, what we do is we take that very high inflation over 3 years and we'll use it to adjust the long-term inflation assumption. So an extra 3% a year for the next 3 years might shake out as an extra 0.25% for the next 80 years, for example. I'm making these numbers up, but it's just an illustration of how we go from the actual short-term considerations to the ultimate assumption. Okay.
Okay, any other questions? Well, let's continue, I think, with the presentation, please.
So we're on slide number 14. It's entitled 2019 Valuation Recap. So before we look at where we are now, it's useful to look at the last valuation and to see where we're coming from and give the things Michelle's going to talk about a little context. So the last valuation was very positive. So from 2016, we were, I can read, 84% funded with a deficit of almost £300 million. At 2019, we increased that funding level to 94% with a shortfall of £130 million. So it was a very positive valuation overall. In terms of what that meant for employers, the average future service percentage contribution rate was 16.6% of pay. And then across the fund, on average, well, in total, we're paying 9 million of deficit contributions to recover that 130 million deficit. And that was spread across the employers in various ways, depending on their own particular position. Now, this is where I just want to emphasize again the spread of employers, and you can see that in the chart on the right-hand side. So what we've got on the left-hand axis, we've got funding level, and then across the bottom, we've got total contributions paid. Now, as you might expect, you can see that the higher your funding level, the less you pay, of course, because you're not paying deficit contributions, and potentially you're getting some money back via surplus offsets. Conversely, if your funding level is poor, then you'll be paying more contributions because you're paying future service, plus also deficit contributions to recover what you owe in effect. Now, the bulk group's kind of around 20% of pay and close to 100% funded, as you might expect. That's broadly where the fund is. You do get some outliers. In particular, we see a group in the bottom right who are worse funded and paying higher contributions, and that tends to be a lot of academies and also younger employers. They tend to be down there for a variety of reasons to do with how they're funded compared to how other employers are funded. In terms of future service rates, for example, the highest future service rate in the fund was 28.8% of pay compared to the average of 16.6%. Why would an employer have such a high future service rate? It's normally to do with profile. So it's more expensive to provide benefits for older members. As we said before, you get your money from contributions and investments. If a member is older, you can't invest those contributions for a longer time. So you can't get as much investment returns. So more of the cost of their benefits has to be covered by contributions. So what you'll find is these employers with very high future service rates have likely got very old membership on average, and so it's more expensive for them to provide. But the key point here is you have a lot of variation between your employers, and you need to bear that in mind in everything you do, because the decisions you make, they'll have one impact at fund level overall, but the impact on different groups of employers can vary significantly. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll just focus on that real discount rate, the investment return above inflation that I've talked about, and the process we go through. So what we do as part of the valuation we did in 2019 is we look at the fund's investment strategy, the long-term strategy. We run that through our models and we come up with a range of potential outcomes. So at the valuation in 2019, we thought there was a 50-50 chance effectively that you'd return CPI plus 2.5%, 6% chance you return CPI plus 1.8%, and so forth. Now you might wonder, why don't we just set the discount rate at 2.5%? The short answer is we can't. There's a requirement within the valuation to have some prudence in there. There's also a common sense requirement. You don't want to set a valuation plan where there's a 50% chance that you are not paying in enough, and effectively then you're leaving a bill to future taxpayers and future generations. So you want to have some prudence in there, and you need to. So then you look at the range of options and you arrive at a position that strikes a reasonable balance, as I've talked about before, between affordability of contributions and sitting at a risk level that you're